This is Immuno Africa, a podcast dedicated to spotlighting African immunology research.
Screening programs should be organized such that it encompasses all these three, where we're focusing on the microbiome that is available. We are also looking at the type of immunity or immune responses that are occurring there, so that in interventions, in therapeutic interventions or other.
Welcome to the Immunology in Africa podcast. I am your host, Welt Okete. In this episode, I speak with Professor Samuel Essien-Baidoo, an Associate Professor of Laboratory Medicine at the University of Cape Coast, Ghana. We talk about his research, highlighting a recent study that explored cervical cancer risk in women, and discuss how he navigates the challenges that doing research comes with. If it's your first time here, kindly support our work by subscribing to this podcast and turning on notifications to keep up with new episodes. We're currently on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, and other streaming platforms. So let's meet Professor Essien-Baidoo.
My name is Professor Samuel Essien-Baidoo. I am an Associate Professor in Laboratory Medicine and a fellow of the West African College of Medical Laboratory Science. Currently, I work with the University of Cape Coast. I teach in a number of faculties and departments because of my background, but I'm attached to the Department of Medical Laboratory Science. My academic journey started way back in the late 90s in the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, where during my undergraduate, I was interested in infectious diseases, understanding the epidemiology, how the pathogenesis of the diseases occur, and more importantly, how to diagnose and treat them. So these leanings led to my postgraduate degree in clinical microbiology, where I wanted to get a lot more insights into what pathogens are like and how diseases are transmitted and managed. In between that, I had the exposure and the experience of working with the Kumasi Center for Collaborative Research into Tropical Medicine, where I was a technical staff attached to the laboratory, and I was privileged to work on the malaria drug trial at the time, the TB HIV project at the time, and then also the Borrelia project that was running at the time. So having gone through that experience and also studying clinical microbiology at the graduate level, I found my way into academia, where I started off doing a couple of part-time jobs, teaching in some public and private universities, and then eventually I joined the University of Cape Coast. Now, in course of my engagement with the University of Cape Coast, I had a scholarship to go and study PhD in laboratory medicine. And during this period, having gained the understanding and insights into infectious diseases, one of the things that was very unique at the time was the interplay between infectious diseases and then the immune system, how the body is carefully designed to put checks and balances on how it should behave when it encounters foreign substances. So during my PhD, my focus went into exploring the interplay between natural and artificial determinants of health. More importantly, looking at how infectious and non-infectious diseases are regulated in terms of our bodies, amongst many other things. And so I focused a lot more on the clinical immunology aspect and then gained some insights into that. So having come back to the University of Cape Coast to continue with my work, I've since been teaching in the Department of Medical Laboratory Science, where I teach immunology, I teach some aspects of the microbiology, And then also along the line, I acquired some masters in health law and ethics. So I also teach that as well in terms of my professional background.
So the graduate program, you undertook your PhD. So I think we should just start with that first of all. Take us a bit deeper. Let's look at what you did and then some of the findings that came out of that work.
Thank you. So during my PhD studies, initially we looked at various forms of cancers. We were more interested in understanding the immune modulatory mechanisms in these cancers. So my focus largely was on melanoma, lung cancer, and then breast cancer at the time. Now, what we did at the time, what I did at the time was to investigate how the tumor microenvironment behaves in terms of the immune cells and how they regulate the progression of tumors, or how they truncate the progression of tumors. So my major study was to identify a product that we could use in modulating how tumors behave in the system. So my mainstay in terms of the cancers was focused on melanoma, where we found a beta-glucan that we derived from a mushroom derivative known as the Lentinus edots. So we noticed that from that study, the beta-1,3 derivative was more potent in truncating tumor progression, but did not cause the tumors to recede. Largely due to some factors like the myeloid-derived suppressor cells, and then the T regulatory cells interplaying with some pro-inflammatory cytokines. So the major highlights from that study was that, yes, we could use beta-glucan derivatives from some specific mushrooms to stop tumors from progressing. But at the time of leaving, we were unable to ascertain whether these beta-glucans could cause the tumors to recede.
Thanks a lot for that interesting narrative. So, because I'm just thinking now, your current work, is it more of cancers now and if all infectious disease, or there's just this perfect mix of both?
So I'd say it's a perfect mix of both, because then my most recent work that looked at vaginal microbiome and then cervical cancer combined both concepts. Again, one of the things that I'm sure you would agree with me on is that research drives are also related to funding opportunities amongst many others. And, in academic studies and in academic environments, what is usually important is the acquisition of a skill and the knowledge, and then you'd want to use that to bridge the gap between whatever constructs that you have. If you look at infectious diseases and if you look at immunology, there's a very thin line between them, because there are cross-cutting issues when it comes to how the microbes behave, how the body accepts or rejects them, the mechanisms that they go through. For instance, why is it that when you encounter certain pathogens, your immune cells are able to identify them and clear them? And why is it that some of them are able to evade the immune system? These same mechanisms also apply in the cancers. So for instance, when tumors begin to generate, there are instances where, due to immune surveillance, the cells may be identified and dealt with. And there are instances where they have mechanisms they use in evading the immune system. So you could apply the knowledge from either side in understanding the concepts. And with my background in both areas, it makes it easier for me to delve into issues like that.
Good. Thank you very much. So back to the initial question I wanted to ask. I wanted to ask about what growing up was like for you, and perhaps you had personal experiences or experiences in your community with some of these diseases. Maybe that's triggered your interest that, okay, I want to do research and solve this problem in my community, or your interest developed from maybe other kinds of experiences. That's what I wanted to ask about.
I think largely, understanding some of these concepts began from my undergraduate studies where, we were exposed to the nature of diseases, how diseases come about. You're looking basically from the disease transmission cycle and things, and then you're beginning to gain insights into diseases from microbes and things like that. And then you look at the environment, and then you realize that a lot of these determinants are found in the environment. And so largely, you would understand the things a bit more, and then your interest will be drawn into these things. So largely, I think that these were some personal experiences, having grown up in my neighborhood and seeing some people go through some disease phases, amongst many other things, drew my interest into understanding those concepts a lot more. So for instance, if you take parasitic infections, for instance, we lived in an environment where people were predisposed to picking up the infections because of lack of proper sanitation, lack of proper toilet facilities, amongst many others. And you could clearly see some of the clinical manifestations of acquiring some of these parasitic infections within the community, having studied them in school and things like that. This obviously were things that drew my interest into aligning towards understanding the concepts in infectious diseases. And so that was how I started.
I quickly want us to look into some of the really interesting projects, like the one you talked about on the cervical cancer, the vagina. So let's delve into that work and let's tell us about what it was like conducting that research and what were your findings and what implications would they have for Ghanaians and maybe the wider African or global populace.
What drew our interest into that study was largely because in recent times, we're looking at normal or microbiomes that are in the body, and then how they are implicated in some disease conditions, and more importantly, how they help modulate immune responses, amongst many others. So globally, there's been a lot of inquest into areas like gut microbiomes and how they affect the acquisition and pathogenesis, and more importantly, the pathology of some of the conditions that are associated with the gut. We also noticed that when you take the female vagina, for instance, it is one of the areas that you find quite a number of microbes colonizing. And over the period, from my clinical experience, you've had a lot of women in their reproductive ages coming in for diagnosis and treatment for one condition or the other. And coupled with the things we see in our environment and how some of these infections are prominent and could have deleterious effects on the women, we felt that we needed to understand the role of the microorganisms in this area, and then more importantly, try to understand how they regulate the acquisition of immunity when it comes to their exposure and things like that. So we did our literature review, and we found out that cervical dysbiosis, for instance, which aggravates infections, is very heightened for its role in immune modulation, particularly during cervical cancer. And what we found out largely at the time in our literature review was that the nature of the microbiome in the vagina usually promotes the shifting of the type of immunity from either Th1 to Th2, or in some instances, vice versa. So what we did was to basically design a study that estimated and compared the levels of inflammatory cytokines like interleukin-4, interleukin-6, interleukin-10, and then tumor necrosis factor alpha, and then interferon gamma. And we try to identify the different grades of cervical intraepithelial neoplasia with cervicovaginal infections. We wanted to understand how these three major things come about in terms of their interplay. So we estimated and compared the levels among women who were above a certain age. And so in our study, largely, we found out that about 8.9% of the women had cervical intraepithelial neoplasia, and about 7.6% of them were very massive. Now, what we noticed was that the main predictor for cervical intraepithelial neoplasia was age, which was about 46 years. And then we noticed that bacterial vaginosis, for instance, and then candida infection were significantly elevated in women who had the cervical intraepithelial neoplasia. And again, when we did our comparison with the inflammatory cytokines and the others, then we also noticed that interleukin-10 and tumor necrosis factor alpha concentrations were elevated in people who also had cervical intraepithelial neoplasia. And so in all these, our conclusion largely was that a significant proportion of women in especially rural settings would have various grades of cervical intraepithelial neoplasia, which would need robust screening programs beyond the usual ones that we do and things like that. And then also, we also concluded that it is possible that the immune cells that we evaluated were responsible for modulating the responses that these women experience by shifting the Th1 type immunity to Th2 type immunity. So largely, our findings suggest that in cases of cervical dysbiosis, where you have infections occurring, it could cause immune suppression in these women so that the infections would prolong. And it could also create a suitable microenvironment for development of the cervical intraepithelial neoplasia, which will link towards development of cervical cancer. And so we recommend largely that screening programs should be organized such that it encompasses all these three, where we're focusing on the microbiome that is available. We are also looking at the type of immunity or immune responses that are occurring there, so that in interventions, in therapeutic interventions or other interventions, we're looking at probably shifting the balance from Th2 to Th1 so that the immune cells can target these changes and arrest them so as to prevent these women from developing cervical intraepithelial neoplasia. These were the things that we recommended in that study. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. So that's a lot to take in. I think the summary of what you did was to kind of understand the microbes in the vagina and then link it with the immune system and how it can predispose women to cervical intraepithelial neoplasia. So that's a mouthful. And I think from what you said, that cervical intraepithelial neoplasia kind of is like the it's possible for it could develop into or increase someone's risk for cervical cancer, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and
exactly.
you are recommending that screening program for cervical cancer should be broadened or holistic enough to identify some of these indices, your immune cells and cytokines,
the microbiome, that's microorganisms in the vagina, and then all of this, so that we can spot the women that we have to help on time before things get out of hand.
You've done a good summary.
Thank you very much. I think it's a
That's
very
awesome.
interesting study, because I think late last year there were African countries. Okay, I can't speak for all the countries, but I know Nigeria, we started like what's it called now? Vaccination programs for cervical cancer, the human papilloma virus vaccination, and we got vaccines here in Nigeria. And I think a few other African countries got to. So cervical cancer is something that the World Health Organization, global funders for vaccination programs are really interested in, because of projections for women and young girls, especially, just trying to protect them from developing the cancer and keep them alive in the long term. So I think it's really, really a powerful study. So well done again for that wonderful research. I want to ask, what was like the age range you explored, you looked into?
So we looked at women 40 years and above, because from literature, again, these women are the ones that are usually predisposed to developing cervical cancer. And actually, some of the constructs we're interested in, for instance, were the level of education. We looked at the number of lifetime partners they have had, because that could also influence the diversity of the microbiome. Then we looked at issues of contraceptive use, which also has been shown to also influence the microbiome in the vagina. And also other issues relating to alcohol usage and drug usage, amongst many other things, that also influences the microbiome and then alters the immune responses. So largely, these were the groups that, these were some of the constructs that we looked at in terms of the demography of the participants that we included in our study.
Okay, fascinating. So all of these indices that we are looking at, those would affect the microorganisms in their vagina. It could also contribute to them developing cervical cancer in the long run, right?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. Interesting. So I'm just wondering if this findings from this study, I know you explored the particular age group, but whether you think, of course, as someone in the field, whether findings from this study could be applied to maybe younger age bracket, because I know individuals that are currently being targeted for the vaccines that are out are really young girls that have a low risk for contracting, for getting the cancer, and just to protect them when they get into that at-risk age range. So do you think like maybe a similar study can be conducted in these young girls? So maybe if it will help us spot individuals that would need vaccines, or those that probably vaccines might not need vaccines in the long run. Of course, I know some of these factors, some of those very young girls might not be exposed to them yet, but do you think there's a way we could design a similar study to cater to that age group or setting?
It wouldn't be out of place to look at people below this age bracket, because again, it is becoming very common. One of the things that is becoming very common and worrying is about the extent to which these young females use contraceptives, and then the indications of multiple partners leaving one relationship to the other and not using protection, amongst many others. Unfortunately, in the space also, there's a worrying trend currently going on where a lot of women, young women, are engaging in other activities. People are using scented soap and other things to wash and clean the vagina, which obviously would alter the pH of the vagina and would also largely affect the kind of microorganisms that may be predominating in this area. So yes, we could look at the findings from this study and then look at what is happening within that age group that could also alter the microbiome, and then focus on some of these determinants and see if we could draw a link between that and then the development of cervical intraepithelial neoplasia. It's possible.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. So whatever age group you're looking at, you'd have to identify the kind of indices that they are exposed to, or the kind of factors they're exposed to that would influence the microorganisms in their vagina that could contribute to them developing the intraepithelial neoplasia in the cervical. Yeah.
Exactly.
Thank
So
you.
we could largely look at young women in the reproductive age below 40 years, and then ascertain what they do in terms of some of these indices, and then compare and then see if the findings will lean towards what we found in the older women, who obviously from literature have been shown to be at risk of developing cervical cancer.
Yeah. I think it would be an interesting study and will really contribute to current efforts to vaccinate younger women or young girls, and also ensure that the young generation are protected. Their risk for the cancer is drastically reduced, so they don't come down with it in the course of their lifetime. So thank you so much for such an amazing study, and thank you for sharing it here. So quickly, is there something else you wanted to mention about the study before I go to the next phase of the interview?
So what we're trying to do now, again, from this study is to see if we could delve a bit further into the molecular mechanisms that interplay this interaction. So what we're trying to do now is to go a bit deeper into understanding the exact molecular mechanisms. So for instance, we're trying to look at the pathways through which these immune interactions occur, what signaling molecules are involved, and other things, and also to probably identify the strains of the specific microorganisms that we came across, to see if there are specific strains that are associated with these immune modulatory mechanisms, and so that they can be specific targets for therapeutic interventions. That is what we're thinking of doing in the future.
Next, I want us to talk about what you've done in research ethics, which you started exploring recently. So let's know what you are doing there. What got you interested and what you've been doing there over the past couple of years?
This is an interesting one. So in the last couple of years, I also have come to understand that as humans, we deserve the best. So when you look at the history of bioethics and what happened in the 18th and the 19th century that led to the Nuremberg Code and other things, and how in Africa, for instance, in our quest to develop vaccines as immunologies, there has been quite a number of ethical challenges we've faced. And I can mention in Nigeria, for instance, the Pfizer case in the 90s, amongst many others. I also became interested in that area to understand the ethical implications of our research and clinical practice, especially on health. And so I took a lot of interest in understanding the regulatory space and then the ethical issues relating to health and research. So in recent times, that is what I've been doing. Particularly, my focus has been on two major areas: issues relating to patient safety, patient management when it comes to consent and confidentiality. One of the things I uncovered recently is about issues relating to how we in Ghana, for instance, do not meet the requirements of the law when it comes to obtaining consent prior to medical treatment, amongst many others. If you look at our regulations, there's a very clear definition of what consent is valid and what consent is void. And one of the things in clinical practice or in medical practice that is important is about voluntary consent based on full disclosure of medical indications and medical implications. So for instance, if I'm a surgeon and I want to conduct an operation or a surgery, I need to let the client know there are alternatives to that approach, and the client should understand clearly what these approaches mean. And then more importantly, use that information to decide on what approach they want voluntarily, without coercion, without force, without duress or anything. And so we started exploring that, and I tried to put together a paper on how various clinical personnel go about obtaining informed consent prior to medical treatment. The other area has to do with regulation in terms of the ethical issues within the regulatory space of clinical practice. Sometimes we see regulatory agencies sanction some advertisements, amongst many other things, that scientifically do not really align, because then you would want to use the science to question the sanctioning of some of these things we find in our environment. For instance, you hear some adverts that sanction the practice of deworming every 3 months. And then you ask yourself, what exactly are you deworming against? Because if you look at the various classes of worms or parasites, for instance, there are different drugs that are used in treating them. Are you looking at the implications on the individual's liver, the kidney? Is it something that is contributing to the number of dialysis cases we're seeing and things like that? Then we also have issues of regulatory stuff in how health setups are designed, amongst many other things. You finish with your education in the university, and because of no formal employment by government, you get a small space and then you start off a health setup. Sometimes you look at the requirements from the regulatory agencies, and then you ask yourself questions about, did these people meet the regulations? Yet they have licenses to practice. What are the ethical implications of some of the things that they do? Now, again, it is also becoming very common that we're moving into the era of genomic medicine, amongst many others. There are issues of reproductive health being advanced, where now people are deciding to store their eggs. Males are even deciding to store their semen so they can use it for at a later time and things like that. What are the ethical implications? So largely, these are a few of the things that I've been looking at over the period in relation to healthcare ethics and law. Thank you.
It's really obvious that you're trying to solve problems that you've identified in Ghana, and of course that might also be applicable to maybe other parts of the continent. So yeah, so quickly before we talk about IUIS and what you did there, I would just like you to just comment a bit on maybe challenges that you've had to grapple with in your journey as a scientist, maybe from while you were a very young scientist, or maybe more recently, how you dealt with those challenges that you surmounted, or maybe the ones that you are still going through. Perhaps you would inspire someone that would be listening.
Okay, thank you. I always admit that the way we practice medicine today was not the same 2 decades ago when we started practicing medicine. It's changing, it's evolving. And you realize that to understand the intricacies that are associated with health, research becomes very fundamental. The challenges over the period has been the quest to conduct research and understand some of these mechanisms that we're gladly talking about today. The major challenge has been funding and access to information. I think early on in my career, the difficulty was access to information. I mean, the internet wasn't as good as today. You didn't have access to it. I remember I used to walk and then go and wait for the librarian to put in a request. to get abstracts from PubMed or Medline just for my undergraduate thesis. And then it will take almost a month for me to get a response. And then you get only about 5 or 6 abstracts at a time. And that is what you have to go and work with. And so you relied on textbooks that were not very current. And so were not very elucidative in understanding what was in vogue at the time. And growing up, you realize that the major challenge in Africa has been funding for research, funding locally, funding externally, amongst many others. Our government institutions are very reluctant to fund scientists. And so you'd have to compete with the rest of the people out there. Sometimes even in understanding issues in your local context, you have to rely on people from outside your continent, outside your country, to give you money to conduct research and things like that. That has been a major challenge. That has been a major challenge. You know, sometimes you go out there, and I know a lot of young Africans are very inspired, and so they want to learn a lot more. So they get scholarships and opportunities to travel outside the continent to go and study and things like that. And when you go there, you are exposed to high-end technologies amongst many other things. And then you come back to your home country, the major challenge is that you don't have access to this technology, you don't have access to this equipment, and then it becomes difficult for you to replicate the things that you have learned. Even in situations where you have some funding or some money to bring in some of these equipments for research and other things, the taxes alone would prevent you from doing that. So if you look at the space, largely the challenge has been issues relating to funding, opportunities, equipment, and supplies to aid in research, particularly in our part of the world. What I have done over the period is to identify 1 or 2 people. I think that there is always strength in numbers. So what I've done is to identify people globally and in the continent especially, form teams and partners so we could be a bit more competitive in our assessment of funding opportunities and grants and things like that. Now, mind you, because of lack of funding, we are unable to delve into the spaces where people who have the funding and then the equipment will delve into. So you are at a competitive disadvantage when you go into the same market to go and look for funding with someone who is probably studying things at the molecular level. And that is one major challenge. And over the period, I think that we're doing our best. We're collaborating with people from other African countries so that funders would understand that, look, the problems we have, it's not only limited to a particular country, but cuts across other countries or other states and things like that. And so it makes it easier to get funders to understand the enormity of the issue, and then they lean a lot more towards giving you some of these funds for you to conduct research. Largely, that has been the difficulty for most scientists. That has been the difficulty for most scientists. And we continue to navigate these waters and then see how best we can explore funding opportunities. But I think that our government institutions and our countries should be committed a lot more to the science environment and push a lot for money into the environment. You agree with me that when COVID-19 came, for instance, we struggled a little bit. We had to even rely on funding and vaccines from outside the continent and things like that. And if you talk to most of the scientists here, they would tell you that, look, we're capable of manufacturing these vaccines. We are capable of conducting research into how to develop these vaccines, amongst many other things. But we don't have the infrastructure. We don't have the funding to do it. And I think that is a major challenge when it comes to research in Africa and not Ghana alone. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. Look, really profound challenges. So, like you mentioned about getting abstract, I've always wondered, like, individuals that studied in the 80s, 90s, 70s, how did they write their project? Because now students can easily just get access to lots of tons and tons of journal articles, open access online. There are even avenues for even getting some of them that are not really open access. So, yeah, I think the access to information, I know it was, I can um I suspect that it was really tough having to write your dissertation with just 6 abstracts and get information from textbooks. Yeah, and I love the word you used to describe African governments. Of course, for most countries in Africa, reluctance, like I think that's just the best term to describe them. There's just no will or commitment to support scientific research and development. Perhaps things are getting better slowly, but I think we can do better, and we really should do much more better, our government especially. But something I was really pretty surprised to learn about, I am quite familiar with, okay, having to import tools, but I've never thought about taxes and how taxes could play could serve as a barrier or hurdle to having to import tools from other countries of the world. So government should also play a part in that. I think if scientists are bringing in tools, bringing in lab equipment and various consumables to conduct research to serve the African populace, we shouldn't be taxing them so much to make use of those things, because of course the whatever results or findings they come up with will still benefit our continent, benefit our own people. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And of course, you mentioned collaborations, which is a very beautiful way that you found to tackle some of the challenges, especially one with funding, that when you are able to, stretch your network outside of your local country, your own country, and then find connections with other scientists doing something similar or having similar problems in their countries, you can convince funders. Sadly, those funders are not in Africa to, to send you something. Provide funds for you to conduct research for Africa. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your story. So quickly, I would like us to talk about IUIS conference last year. When I learned it was going to take place in Africa, I think it's the first time it will be taking place in Africa. Correct me if I'm wrong. I was like, oh, this sounds good. I didn't get to attend both the online and the physical version, but I think for someone who attended, you can just give us the juice of the event. What were the highlights? And I believe because it held in Africa, there would have been conversations around immunology in Africa. So what were some of those highlights from the event?
Thank you. So IUIS Cape Town was unique, and I must say that it was well attended by African scientists in immunology. I mean, I was really intrigued when I saw the number of people from all over Africa attending, and particularly in my country, from my country, sorry. For me, the major highlight was the extent of research African scientists have done into vaccine development, considering the challenges that we've had with funding opportunities and other things. I mean, it was really intriguing to notice that a lot more African scientists residing in Africa and even those outside of Africa were interested in developing vaccines and other therapeutic interventions to combat diseases in Africa. And it was really interesting. The findings from most of these researches were very novel and awesome and were eye-opening. People had gone very far in understanding some of these things. And I must say that it was the highlight for me where we had a lot more people from Africa, young scientists especially, coming to showcase what they have done. I met a couple of student scientists, and again, that was also very, very impressive. This was one of the IUIS conferences I have attended and come across a lot of student scientists also showcasing what they have done during their masters and PhDs and things like that. And I believe, given the opportunity, Africa, we can do a lot more. We have what it takes to do what other people are doing. Given the opportunity, I'm sure what we saw at IUIS 2023, we would see a lot more than that. Thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So I'm really excited that the highlight for you were some of the conversations on vaccine development, because I know the Africa CDC, the AU, they've been trying to channel funds into that. Of course, some international organizations have also provided support to strengthen Africa's capacity for vaccine development. So it makes a lot of sense that we already have scientists who are working in the field and ensuring that there is a place for us to build up from in developing our vaccines. We just hope that there's this strong collaboration between the government and then scientists and then private agencies to actualize some of these dreams and expectations.
Sure.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Prof, for your time. I've enjoyed every bit of the conversation, from your work on, from your journey, of course, and how you took interest in immunology, infectious diseases, and your experience from the classroom to your own community, and then your work especially on CIN, cervical intraepithelial neoplasia. I think that would be one term that I've learned from this conversation today that would stick. And then, of course, your experience working on research ethics, and then all of the things you've shared, your challenges, and how you've managed to surmount them. Thank you so much for your time. So we'll take your closing remarks now, final words. What's one thing you'd like to share with listeners? One thing you'd like to share with young scientists? One thing you'd like to share with your peers who are Africans or from the diaspora that will be listening to this episode?
Thank you very much. So I'll begin by saying that Africa is well-resourced with astute scientists. And I want to encourage all of us to get together. And just like we started at the IUIS 2023, let's come together and then go into developing vaccines for ourselves and not wait for other people to do that for us. We can do this. If we concert our efforts together and collaborate with each other, we should be able to surmount these challenges. To the young scientists and to my students and other students who probably may be listening, I want to encourage them that the journey is not one that cannot be conquered. You may have challenges, but I am sure the environment created now within the science and more importantly, the medical area makes it a lot more convincing that yes, we can do this. There's a lot out there to explore. There's a lot out there for us to understand. There are lots of opportunities available internally, externally. We should just avail ourselves and then make sure that we follow the process of apprenticeship, and we avail ourselves, more importantly, to go through this journey to understand the basic concepts and then apply them later on. About funding, I want to say that we'll plead with our government agencies, is not only in my country, Ghana, but all over the continent, to be a lot more committed into funding research when it comes to science research. If our economy would grow, it will be based on science. If we're producing, it will be based on science. If we're manufacturing, it will be based on science. So if we're combating diseases, it will be based on science. So if we can get a bit more commitment from governments and agencies in terms of funding scientific research, I am sure that we'll make a headway as a continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode on Immuno Africa. If you enjoyed it, please feel free to share it with your network. You will learn first about future episodes and get other immunology related updates by following Immuno Africa _ or the Immunology in Africa podcast on social media. See you on the next episode.